The moment the glass doors shut behind him, the tension in the room finally broke. Employees began moving again, transactions resumed, but the weight of what had happened lingered. Mr. Hamilton stepped out of his office, his eyes sweeping over the staff. "There will be a mandatory training session on bias and customer service next week," he announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And let me make one thing clear. What happened today is unacceptable. It will not happen again." Nancy knew what that meant. She knew that her position, her authority, her future at the bank was now uncertain, and for the first time she wasn't sure she deserved to keep it. She had spent so much time believing she understood people, believing she could judge a person's worth by the way they presented themselves. But today had shattered that illusion. In the following weeks, Summit Financial implemented significant changes. The training sessions were not just lectures, but immersive programs, forcing employees to confront their unconscious biases and the impact of their assumptions. Nancy sat through every session, absorbing every lesson with the sharp sting of personal experience. She saw the way her colleagues now looked at her, not with respect, but with quiet judgment. She knew she had to earn back their trust, and that would take time. As for Tyler Perry, he didn't just walk away from the incident. He used his platform to speak about the experience, sharing the lesson that wealth doesn't always wear a suit, and dignity isn't measured by the cut of a person's clothes. His story reached thousands, sparking discussions about how people are treated in everyday interactions, about the quiet ways prejudice seeps into institutions that claim to serve everyone. Nancy never forgot that day. She never forgot the look on Tyler Perry's face when he asked if she would have treated him differently had he looked the part. And she never forgot the feeling of realizing she had failed, not just as a bank teller, but as a person. It was a lesson learned the hard way. But sometimes, the hardest lessons are the ones that stay with you forever. As Tyler followed him, Nancy remained standing at her station, feeling the eyes of her colleagues and customers still on her. But the worst part wasn't the stares, or even the humiliation. It was knowing that everything she had done was based on an assumption she had no right to make. And in doing so, she had not only embarrassed herself but also proven Tyler Perry's point in the most public way possible. She had thought she was just enforcing policy. Instead, she had exposed a problem that ran far deeper than a single bank transaction. Nancy sat stiffly in her chair inside Mr. Hamilton's office, her fingers twisted together in her lap. The cold realization of her mistake sat heavy on her chest. She had spent years building her career at Summit Financial, taking pride in her ability to read people, to assess customers with a single glance. Now, everything she had built, all the authority she had prided herself on, was crumbling around her. Across from her, Mr. Hamilton leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable but firm. "Nancy," he started, his voice measured. "Do you understand the severity of what happened today?" She swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Yes, sir, I do." "Do you?" He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Because I don't think you do. You didn't just make a mistake, Nancy. You made a decision, an assumption that resulted in humiliating one of our most high-profile clients. If Mr. Perry hadn't been who he is, if this had been just another customer, would you have treated them any differently?" Nancy hesitated, the truth weighing down on her tongue. She wanted to defend herself, to argue that she had only been doing her job, that she was following protocol, but she knew, deep down, that none of those excuses mattered. The truth was, she had made a judgment, and it had backfired in the worst way possible. "I was wrong," she admitted, her voice quieter than she had intended. "I let my own biases affect my judgment." Mr. Hamilton nodded, leaning forward. "That's the first honest thing you've said since you walked in here. But an apology isn't enough. This isn't just about you and Mr. Perry. It's about the kind of culture we allow to thrive here. If you felt justified in treating him that way, how many other customers have you made feel small? How many people have walked out of here thinking they didn't belong because of the way they were treated?" Nancy opened her mouth, but there was nothing to say. She had no way to argue against what was now painfully obvious. Outside the office, the bank continued its operations. But there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. Employees whispered in small clusters, exchanging glances whenever she walked by. The customers who had witnessed the incident earlier were still talking, their hushed voices carrying the weight of what had transpired. The damage had already been done. Meanwhile, in the VIP office, Tyler Perry sat across from Mr. Hamilton, signing the necessary paperwork for his withdrawal. Despite the smooth process now, the earlier experience lingered. "I appreciate you handling this, Hamilton," he said, his tone professional but distant. "But let's be honest. If I wasn't Tyler Perry, this wouldn't have been handled at all." Mr. Hamilton sighed, his fingers tapping lightly against his desk. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "I can't defend what happened today, and I won't try to, but I can promise you that changes will be made." Tyler looked at him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity. He had seen situations like this play out too many times before. People caught in their mistakes, apologizing profusely, promising reform that never came. But there was something in Hamilton's face, something in his voice, that made him believe this time might be different. After the transaction was completed, Tyler stood, shaking Mr. Hamilton's hand firmly. "I'll be watching," he said simply. "And I hope, for the sake of your staff and your customers, that this bank becomes the kind of place where everyone gets treated with respect." With that, he walked out of the office, past the lingering stares of employees who now knew exactly who he was. Nancy stood by her station, frozen in place as he approached. For a moment, she thought he would simply pass her by, leaving her to stew in her own shame. But he stopped, turning to face her. The weight of his gaze was unbearable. "I don't need an apology," he said, his voice even, almost calm. "I don't want one. What I want is for you to think about today, to remember it, and to never let something like this happen again. Not to me, not to anyone else." Nancy felt the heat rise in her face, but she didn't look away. She knew she owed him that much. "I will," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I promise." He studied her for another second, then nodded. "Good." Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. Nancy opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. How was she supposed to explain that she had profiled one of the richest men in the country based solely on his appearance? That she had assumed his request was fraudulent just because he didn't fit her idea of what a wealthy man should look like? She swallowed hard and forced a neutral expression. "I was simply following protocol," she managed, though the words felt weak even to her. "For large withdrawals, we require additional verification and—" Tyler cut in smoothly. "And what exactly about me made you feel that my request wasn't valid?" His voice wasn't raised, but the weight behind his words made the room feel smaller. Nancy felt heat creeping up her neck. "It's not that, Mr. Perry. We just have to be cautious with transactions of this size." Mr. Hamilton's expression darkened. "Cautious?" he repeated, his voice edged with disappointment. He turned to Tyler. "I deeply apologize for any inconvenience, Mr. Perry. I assure you this is not how we typically conduct business." Tyler tilted his head slightly. "Isn't it?" he asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like it's exactly how business is conducted, at least when the customer doesn't look the part." Nancy felt her breath catch. She knew exactly what he was implying, and worse, she had no defense. The silence that followed was deafening. The other bank employees had paused their tasks, subtly listening in, their faces tense. A few customers who had been present during the exchange now watched with keen interest. Mr. Hamilton cleared his throat and turned to Nancy. "Let me be absolutely clear. Our policies exist to protect all clients, but they are to be enforced fairly, without bias. If a customer provides valid identification, their transaction should be processed without delay or suspicion, regardless of how they look." His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "Did Mr. Perry provide valid identification?" Nancy hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Did his account have sufficient funds?" Another nod. Mr. Hamilton exhaled through his nose, his displeasure evident, then explained to me why he was denied service. Nancy felt her throat tighten. She had no answer that wouldn't condemn her. She shifted uncomfortably and tried to salvage the situation. It wasn't my intent to discriminate, sir. I was just being thorough." Tyler let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "Being thorough," he echoed. "That's a good one. Tell me something, Nancy. If I had walked in here wearing a tailored suit, if I had driven up in a Rolls-Royce instead of walking in off the street, would you have questioned me the same way?" Nancy opened her mouth, but hesitated. She knew the answer. Everyone did. Tyler leaned in slightly. "You see, I didn't come here today just to make a withdrawal. I came here because I've seen this type of thing happen too many times before. People in positions like yours making snap judgments based on nothing but appearance. I came to see if things had changed." He let his words settle, then added, "They haven't." The weight of the moment pressed heavily on Nancy's shoulders. She had always prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to assess people and situations quickly. But now, that instinct had betrayed her. She had misjudged not just a man, but a powerful figure, one who now held the attention of everyone in the bank. Mr. Hamilton turned back to Tyler. "Mr. Perry, again, I sincerely apologize. This is unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for ensuring that it never happens again." Tyler studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I appreciate that, but apologies aren't enough. The real question is, what are you going to do about it?" The bank manager straightened. "We will be addressing this immediately. There will be a review of our training and policies to ensure this type of bias doesn't affect our service. And as for Nancy," he turned to her, his gaze firm, "we will be having a serious conversation about her future with this institution." Nancy's stomach twisted into a painful knot. She had known there would be consequences, but hearing them out loud made it all too real. Tyler nodded again. "Good," he said simply. Then, with an air of finality, he turned back to Nancy. "I hope you learned something from this," he said, "because the real loss here isn't just your job. It's the opportunity to be better." Nancy felt the weight of his words sink in, and for the first time she wasn't just embarrassed. She was ashamed. Tyler turned to Mr. Hamilton. "Now, if it's not too much trouble, I'd still like to make that withdrawal." Mr. Hamilton straightened. "Of course, Mr. Perry, right this way." He gestured toward his office, offering Tyler a more private space for his transaction. Annoyed, but determined to prove herself right, Nancy turned to her computer and pulled up the account details. She punched in the numbers and waited. Within seconds, her screen loaded with information, and her breath caught in her throat. The balance in his account was staggering. She stared at the digits, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It didn't make sense. There were millions in his account. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but she quickly masked it. "One moment," she said stiffly, standing up from her chair. Without another word, she walked over to the assistant branch manager and whispered, "We have a problem. There's a man at my counter claiming he wants to withdraw 25 grand, but he looks, well, let's just say I highly doubt the money is his." The assistant manager glanced over at the man and frowned. "Did you check his ID?" Nancy nodded. "Yes, and his name is Tyler Perry." The assistant manager's frown deepened. He seemed to recognize the name but didn't comment on it. "And what's the issue?" "The issue is that he looks homeless. There's no way he actually has this kind of money." The assistant manager sighed, rubbing his temple. "Nancy, if his ID matches the account and the funds are there, just process the withdrawal." Nancy clenched her jaw, feeling frustrated. There had to be a mistake. She turned back toward the man, who was now casually observing the elegant chandeliers above, as if he had all the time in the world. She walked back to her station, forcing her expression into neutrality. "Sir, I'm going to need additional verification for this transaction." The man raised an eyebrow. "Additional verification?" "I provided my ID and my bank card. That should be enough." Nancy's tone hardened. "For security purposes, I need to confirm the nature of your account activity. We have strict policies regarding large withdrawals, especially for accounts that don't typically make transactions of this size." The man studied her for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose. "I see," he said, his voice unreadable. "And if I were wearing a suit, would you be asking me these same questions?" Nancy felt her face heat up. "Excuse me, I'm asking," he continued, his voice remaining steady. "If I looked like I belonged in this bank, would you still be treating me like a suspect?" Nancy scoffed. "Sir, this is just standard protocol." The man's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Right. Standard protocol." Before Nancy could reply, another voice interrupted. "Is there a problem here?" Nancy turned her head, and her stomach dropped. Walking toward them was the branch manager, a well-respected man known for his fairness. He strode confidently, but as soon as his eyes landed on the man at the counter, his expression completely shifted, from neutral curiosity to instant recognition. His lips parted slightly before breaking into a warm smile. "Mr. Perry," he greeted, extending a hand. "It's an honor to have you here today. What brings you to our branch?" Nancy's blood ran cold. She looked back at the man in front of her, the man she had just interrogated, dismissed, and treated like he didn't belong. And at that moment, everything clicked into place. Tyler Perry, the billionaire filmmaker, the Hollywood mogul, the man whose face was instantly recognizable to nearly everyone, except her. Her breath caught in her throat. She had just made the worst mistake of her career. The air in the bank grew thick with tension as Nancy's mind scrambled for an explanation, her pulse hammering against her ribs. She had dismissed him, interrogated him, and even called for security, all while assuming he was just another nobody trying to pull a fast one. And now, standing before her, shaking hands with the branch manager, was Tyler Perry, the billionaire filmmaker, playwright, and entertainment mogul. The same man she had treated like an intruder was now being welcomed with open arms by the highest-ranking figure in the bank. She felt her stomach twist into knots. Mr. Hamilton, the branch manager, beamed at Tyler. "It's always a pleasure to have you here, Mr. Perry. What brings you in today?" His voice was rich with respect, a stark contrast to the way Nancy had spoken to the man just moments ago. Tyler glanced at Nancy before returning his gaze to the manager. His lips curled slightly, the amusement evident in his eyes. But there was something else, too, something measured and calculated. "I came in for a simple withdrawal," he said, "but it seems I've run into a bit of a process." Mr. Hamilton's brows knitted together as he looked between them. "A process?" His eyes settled on Nancy, and the shift in his expression made her stomach drop even further. "Nancy," he said, his voice dipping into something sharper, "what exactly seems to be the issue here?" Tyler Perry goes undercover as a homeless man and exposes shocking bias at a luxury bank. The morning sun cast a golden hue over downtown Atlanta, reflecting off the towering glass buildings that lined the streets. The city was alive with movement, business professionals in tailored suits rushing to their offices, cars honking in the distance, and the rhythmic sound of high heels clicking against the pavement. Among the grandeur stood Summit Financial Bank, a high-end financial institution known for catering to Atlanta's wealthiest clients. Its marble floors gleamed under the bright chandeliers, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the faint perfume of expensive cologne. The bank prided itself on efficiency, professionalism, and most of all, exclusivity. Clients who entered were accustomed to first-class service, where personal bankers greeted them with warm smiles and ensured their every need was met. But this elite service came with an unspoken rule. Appearances mattered. Behind the teller counter, Nancy Caldwell adjusted her blazer and fixed her name tag, her sharp eyes scanning the line of waiting customers. She had worked at the bank for over a decade, developing a keen ability to judge who was worth her time. In her experience, people who dressed well and carried themselves with confidence were the ones who mattered. Those who looked like they had money usually did, and those who didn't? They were either here to cash their last paycheck or make some desperate request. She sighed as she flipped through the morning's transaction reports. She enjoyed her job, especially on days like this when the bank was bustling with important clients. It was a world she understood, structured, predictable, and filled with people who belonged. The bell at the entrance chimed softly, and almost instinctively, Nancy glanced up. The moment she saw him, her brows furrowed in irritation. A man had just walked in, his clothes wrinkled, his shoes worn out, and a tattered backpack slung over his shoulder. His unkempt beard and the slight hunch in his posture gave the immediate impression of someone who didn't belong. He stepped forward with a slow, deliberate pace, taking in the luxurious interior of the bank, as if he had never seen anything like it before. Nancy exchanged a glance with one of her co-workers, rolling her eyes slightly. "This one's probably lost," she muttered under her breath, before returning her attention to the well-dressed businessman in front of her. But the man didn't. He got in line. Nancy's jaw tightened as she watched him stand there among the bank's usual clientele. Men in designer suits checking their watches, women in silk blouses typing away on their phones, and older gentlemen carrying expensive leather briefcases. The contrast was jarring. The man stuck out like a sore thumb. As the line moved forward, Nancy's impatience grew. She had no tolerance for people who wasted her time, and she was certain this man had no real business here. When it was finally his turn, she forced a tight-lipped smile and gestured for him to step forward. "Next," she said curtly. The man approached the counter with an air of calmness that caught her off guard. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was something composed about the way he moved. He set his backpack down gently and reached into his pocket. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep yet even-toned. "I'd like to make a withdrawal from my account." Nancy barely masked her disbelief. She folded her arms and tilted her head. "Do you have an account with us?" she asked, emphasizing each word as if she were speaking to a child. The man nodded. "Yes, I do." He pulled out a wallet, extracting an ID and a bank card, sliding them across the counter. Nancy didn't bother picking them up right away. She tapped her nails against the desk, glancing down at the name printed on the card. Tyler Perry. Something about it tickled the back of her mind, but she dismissed it. "What amount are you looking to withdraw?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. $25,000, he said without hesitation. Nancy almost laughed. She arched an eyebrow and leaned in slightly. "I'm sorry, did you say 25,000? "Yes," she blinked, struggling to keep her professional demeanor intact. It wasn't the request itself that shocked her. The bank handled large withdrawals every day. But coming from someone who looked like they barely had 25 cents to their name, it was absurd. She let out a short, patronizing chuckle. "Sir, large withdrawals require account verification. I'll need to check your balance and ID. You do have sufficient funds for this, correct?" She expected hesitation, maybe an excuse, or even an embarrassed attempt to leave, but the man simply nodded. "Go ahead and check.